Welcome back, everybody, to the Renaissance Tourism podcast. In today's episode, I will be discussing the origins of nationalism and how it originated in France, contemporary modern nationalism. I'll also discuss briefly how nationalism developed and its origins as well during this podcast. The birthplace of contemporary and modern nationalism is France, which originated from the legacy of the French Revolution in 1789 and is responsible for the revolution within European continent, particularly the Revolution of 1848. The Revolution of 1848 were a series of revolts against European monarchies beginning in Sicily and spreading to France, Germany, Italy, and the Austrian Empire. They all ended in failure, and the repression were followed by widespread disillusionment among the liberals of that time period. Furthermore, the impact of the French Revolutionary Wars from 1793 to 1799 and the French Napoleonic Wars from 1799 to 1815 witnessed the French attempt to conquer the European continent and through this process exported French nationalism, French military technology to the rest of Europe. Nationalism is an ideology based on the premise that individual loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpasses other individual groups or interests. Now I'm going to talk about the Greek historian Herodotus and how he laid the foundations for what we now consider nationalism. The development of nationalism is highly complex in the European context. Nationalism has three origins and related to its process of development. The first of this legacy and in its development is the Greek historian Herodotus, who spent his entire life working on one project. An account of the origins and execution of the Greco-Persian Wars of 1499, my apologies, 499 to 479 BCE. And that's also where we get the name history from as well, from the historian Herodotus. From his name is basically means where we get history from. The Greeks created a sense of difference between the Persian and Greek people, and separate identities would be made from this belief of differences. Furthermore, the Greeks established the core DNA of nationalism. Nationalism must be learned. People require knowledge of their geographical history to identify with the nation state and also the national story, which is something that the French Revolution strongly promoted. What constituted France or French in the 18th century was very much focused on France's cities. In contrast, in its rural areas, communities did not see themselves as French, merely identifying with the regions and having no educational or little educational understanding of the French history and its standing in Europe. This is why to be a nationalist and for a nation to work, a person or people must have a particular view of what it means to be French, English, or German. However, nationalism got a terrible reputation due to the action of Germany and its people's brand of nationalism. In the 20th century, nationalism greatly deteriorated in the general attitude due to the actions of Germany. The author-writer Douglas Murray says that English nationalism, British nationalism, French nationalism are not the problem. What the problem is German nationalism. It led to nearly 100 million deaths in World War II and the deaths of at least 6 million people during the Holocaust. Now, I'm going to talk about Roman nationalism and how Roman nationalism contributed to what we now consider modern nationalism. The imperial Rome period lasted from 31 BCE to 476 AD with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Or if you are a Greek listener or like to be more accurate when it comes down to history, the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, as it's called in the West and in the East, but for the Greeks, it's just the Eastern Roman Empire, and for the Romans themselves, they didn't see themselves as Byzantine, they saw themselves as Roman. And that finally fell in 1453 AD to the Muslim Ottoman Turks. During this period, the Romans established nationalism, uh, these being foreigners and barbarians not having Roman civilization. That's what they saw that what foreignness was, what nationalism was that these over there on the borders, they're the foreigners, they're the anti-civilization, and the Roman identity was people basically living within the empire, and the Romans promoted Roman ideas and how people should govern themselves. For the Romans, whether a person was from North Africa, the Mediterranean, or Arabia, it did not matter. All that mattered was loyalty to the empire and the cultural assimilation into what it meant to be Roman. Roman leaders came from all corners of its empire, and it was not divided along radical lines or racial lines, ethnic groups, or other identities, which we would now consider today being a hallmark of a national identity or a particular culture group. For example, the United States is very much drawn upon radical racial discrimination and racial lines, which plays a prominent role in Americans' politics and the psyche of that nation. In contrast, uh, Britain is divided up upon economic lines between the working classes, the middle classes, and upper classes in countries like England with its class system. French see people who live in France who are French citizens as purely French. They cannot be African or any other ethnic group because, due to the legacy of the French Revolution of 1789, everybody living in France is French. The reason why the French did this was that during the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, there was no sense of a non-urban areas where it meant to be French. So that meant that the government had to promote what actually meant to be French, and therefore everybody who actually lived in France at the time, being from Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Brittany, they all became French. That's the legacy of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Everybody in France finally became French. In contrast, if we were to look at the British Isles, there's the English identity, there's the Welsh identity, there's the Irish identity, and Scottish identity. They're all still their own separate ethnic groups. They haven't been combined to be British. And what British is, to be British is just something that people in Britain use when they're abroad. But when they're in the British Isles, they have English, Scottish, or Welsh. And that's something that's very different to France because everybody in France is French. Everybody in England, I should say Britain, is not British. The English, Scottish, Welsh, or a host of other ethnic groups. There could be Chinese, Mandarin, uh, whichever. That's what it works in. How it works in England. That's why when people move to England, be they Indian, French, German, they can become British with their original ethnic group, ethnic background and culture still connected to them. Because you can be British French, you can be African British, you can be Nigerian British, you can be American British, Canadian British, and that's how it works. But then, obviously, in time, hopefully, then there would be either come part of the local English, Scottish, or Welsh cultures. But that's not going to be the focus of this podcast. Just something for people to be aware of, just because it's very complicated when it comes to those kinds of topics. Now I'm going to talk about the proto-nationalism, how proto-nationalism developed predominantly in Western Europe. For that, I'm going to be looking at particularly England and France. The earliest form of nationalism originated from, like I said before, Western Europe, notably in the Kingdom of England, which has existed from 927 until the present day. With this nation also being an island nation, a sense of Englishness could be developed from the sense of otherness of the European continent. This was developed due to lack of communication technology before the development of the radio, the telephone, telegraph, and other forms of communication in the 19th century. This allowed the English people to develop more independently from other influences throughout the European continent, making them culturally different from their European counterparts. This difference and separation enabled the creation of the English common law, one of the rare legal systems that has developed separately from Roman law that dominated the European continent until this day. In the 21st century, the only two legal traditions are in use are the Roman The common law, my apologies, the Roman law or Old Roman imperial law, and the English common law, which both developed separately, independently of one another. So now we'll establish the creation of separate cultural and legal traditions that help to develop a sense of nationalism. The next part of nationalism generated within the Kingdom of England was in the late 13th century, when England was ruled by King Edward I of England, who ruled that nation. During his rule from 1272 to 1307, Edward I conquered Wales, or the Welsh conquest took place between 1277 and 1283. It is sometimes referred to as the Edwardian conquest of Wales, distinguishing itself from the earlier Norman conquest of England. The, the, the English flag of St. George was used throughout King Edward's rule and continued to be used until the contemporary times. This symbol highlights the emergence of an English identity from the proto-nationalism that will continue to be developed throughout the 13th until the 15th century. Furthermore, compounding the creation of English nationalism was that from 1277 until 1453, England was at constant war with France, Scotland, and other neighbouring kingdoms, dukedoms, and principalities within Western Europe. The Hundred Years' War between 1337 and 1453 also helped to establish separate cultural and physical identities not linked to the French dominant culture and influence that was predominant in England at the time period. So it was these conflicts from 1277 to 1283 helped to establish the English of identity, with the flag of St. George first being used during Edward's Welsh campaign, and how the constant wars in France, in Castile, that's Spain, and also wars in Wales and Scotland helped to develop a sense of difference, a sense of a unique national English identity, as well as the English common law, which further developed the sense that this nation is special, this nation is unique, and it's separate from Europe. So that's one way to actually one tenet of nationalism, that you believe that your country has a right to exist, you believe your people is special, and you believe that your land is unique, and that's what exists today. Though I would say now, with particularly in the Anglo-speaking world, with presidents like Justin Trudeau saying that they are now a post-nation nation, within liberal circles that favour individualism, not collectivism, they don't teach history, and they don't see nationalism as something that's important to a national identity. But also because nationalism has got a very bad name for itself, again, due to German nationalism, which turned the liberals off nationalism, off national identity, and off celebrating a nation's history, because there is the irrational fear that if you love your country, it leads to the use of gas chambers. I know that might sound a bit inflammatory, but there is this element within the liberal traditions. There's the element and fear within culture as well, that you cannot be express your own culture without destroying somebody else's or putting down a different person's beliefs. But there's nothing wrong with actually being proud of your country, whether you be American, or whether you be English, whether you be French, whether you be from Nigeria or from Rwanda. There's nothing wrong to love your country, to love your languages, and to love its unique history. There's nothing wrong with that. But because of the legacy of World War II, nationalism very much has a very bad reputation. Okay, I'm going to sum up this argument now for this podcast. Modern nationalism's birthplace is in France, because the French created the concept of the nation state that became connected to an ethnic group rather than building a massive empire. A nation could sustain itself much longer with the support of one ethnicity in one region. This concept became functional and practical throughout different regions around the globe, enabling nations to hold themselves together by building a collective identity, in contrast to empires that are multi-ethnic and prone to collapse, or internal and external collapse as well, either from foreign threats or threats internally. The French created a stable system to make nations function and develop reasons to keep the state alive. That's why borders today, they can actually hold themselves together, because there's only one ethnic group within that nation, or there's more accurate to say, in modern context, there's one cultural group. For example, in the United States, whether you're African, whether you're Indian, wherever you're from around the world, you're all Americans. That is not one ethnic group, but it is one cultural group. So it's one cultural group that can hold the region together because everybody's singing from the same sings. Everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet and believe pretty much the same belief system. I hope you found today's episode useful. Please leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. And also, if you press like as well, it also does help the podcast. And hope you all enjoyed today's episode. And peace out.